Thanks for joining us. My name is Jazmine Catasús. I'm with the EFA Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, and I'm happy to be moderating this talk about living archives, engagement with archive, with um, our panelists today. So I'm going to introduce the printmaking workshop and our archive and our panelists, and we'll have a bit of a conversation for about 20-25 minutes and then open up for questions. I am the Artistic Director and Master Printer of EFA Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. It is the oldest and longest running community print shop in the United States. We are based in New York City. We are a cooperative printing workspace that provides professional quality printmaking facilities to artists and printmakers of every skill level. We are committed to inspiring and fostering the artistic community. We're dedicated to making fine art prints in an environment that embraces technical and aesthetic exploration, innovation, and collaboration, and seeks to improve overall quality of fine art printmaking by providing low-cost, unfettered access to printers, equipment, and education. The Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop was started by Robert Blackburn in 1947, and it has been living with the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts since 2005. We haven't changed our prices for our members since the 90s. We also have Robert Blackburn's print archive housed at our facilities that contains over 20,000 prints. Many of the artists printed with Robert Blackburn, but also other master printers in the print shop since the 1940s. He was a very welcoming and generous person and never imposed any aesthetic guidelines to the artists that he collaborated with, and encouraged experimentation for non-printmakers in lithography, intaglio, relief, photo processes, and artist books. So our print archives offer the most unique and diverse records of printmaking in the United States and reflects the various communities within the print shop. Over 70 countries are represented in the printmaking workshop, meaning artists from different countries came through the print shop at different times. And we're still collecting members' works today. So it's not only artists that are who have become well known throughout our history, but every person that has made a print in the workshop or in the archives. In 2006, the Library of Congress acquired one set of the archive of 2,044 prints, and we're hoping to place the sets in another public institution. So I'm going to move on to introduce our panelists today. I'll start with Lizania Cruz, who is a member of the print shop, and we have some of her prints at our booth. So after the talk, I see them, and she does a showing proxy. Lizania is a Dominican printmaking artist and designer interested in how migration affects ways of belonging and being. Through research, oral history, and audience participation, she creates projects that highlight a pluralistic narrative on migration. Cruz has been in multiple artist residencies and fellowships. Some notable ones are the Vasari Project, India City Museum, the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshops and Fellowship, Brick Lab, Contemporary Art, a Jerome Hill Artist Fellow, and the International Studio Curatorial Program. She has a solo show at the AR Gallery, QR Foundation, and ICP program, and the Alma Lewis, as well as multiple group exhibitions. In 2021, she was part of Estamos Bien, La Triennial at El Museo de Barrio. And we have Chantal Lee, who is a reference librarian from the Wild Division of Arts and Prints and Photographs at the New York Public Library, serving out of art and architecture in the prints collection, in the picture collection. She works with historians, artists, and students with their visual and scholarly research. She collaborates with partner institutions on library programming around the art collections and hosts classes, workshops on art-based research. For over a decade, she has organized exhibitions, events around poetry and image. Chantal is also the co-director of Olympia an artist's first gallery that promotes the work of women identifying queer, non-binary, and queer artists based in the Lower East Side, New York. We have Stephanie Marie Garcia, is a Miami native and head of special collections and archives for the Miami-Dade Public Library System. As a public librarian archivist, she oversees several significant library collections, reference services, programming, and archives with a team of specialized librarians, archivists, and paraprofessionals. For 20 years, she has engaged in curatorial archives, research fields with many curatorial institutions. She has worked with international artists, artist estates, and private art collections. In 2016, she was awarded and completed her fellowship with the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University. Since 2018, her focus has been to refine and evolve her library collections management, advocate for cultural materials preservation, and provide engaging programming. Next, we have Louise Rapine, who is an archivist with the Vasari Project. And the Vasari Project is a library collection dedicated to documenting, collecting, and preserving Miami-Dade County's art history from 1945 to the present. It is a living archive that grows through contributions from artists, art professionals, exhibition spaces, galleries, institutions, and private donors. The Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop and the Miami-Dade Public Library and Vasari Project currently have an exhibition together. We have Exchange Art Archive and it's called Making Impressions, Archive for Making and Robert Blackburn. So with that, I'm going to with my panelists and let's start the conversation. Maybe Lizania, want to talk a bit?
Okay.
Put you on the spot.
Okay.
About
I could talk a little bit about the work I'm doing currently and why archives are essential to the work and how I'm kind of like thinking of the archive with a new model and thinking a little bit about how the community voice and people's voice that are typically left outside of the archive, I've been trying to incorporate that. So, yeah, as Jazmine say, I'm a participatory artist, and most of the work that I do is long-term projects that are research-based and involves like the audience participation to make the content, make the objects, etc. And currently I'm working on a body of work that is titled The Investigation of the Dominican Racial Imaginary. And it is sort of like similar to a criminal investigation where I'm kind of like collecting evidence and archiving evidence on how the state of the Dominican Republic has erased and suppressed African heritage within our culture and therefore kind of like suppress Blackness within the Dominican consciousness. You know, you've seen the memes out there about how Dominicans don't really feel like they're Black or don't think they're Black, and there is like a context to that. So what I've been trying to do is finding the ways in which history has been told to us in order to create that suppression. And the archives, of course, are essential to that history. So I'm actually going to share, I'm a library nerd, and I go a lot to the New York Public Library. So some of the archives that I've been researching, of course, the New York Public Library, the National Archive in the Dominican Republic. Through the support of the Jerome Foundation, I was able to go to Sevilla and do an action and also research the Archive of the Indies there, which is kind of like, you know, the colony, Spain's colony archive of all the Americas. So that was pretty incredible. But I've worked with the Library of Congress. Yeah, like I worked with some archives here at the University of Miami, the Caribbean Archives. So my approach to looking at the archive is sort of like thinking of Saidiya Harman and this idea of like what, you know, the archive is a tool for speculation, but also kind of like what are the voices that are left in the archive. So what I'll do is I'll share some of the images and then, you know, like talk a little bit about how I've been using it. So currently I have a piece at the open call at the Shed, and the piece is titled Evidence 71, Frederick Douglass and the Commission of Inquiry. And I'm asking people, there's like an interactive touchscreen application that I built as part of the installation. The installation has like prints that I've done at Robert Blackburn. It also has a sculpture, and it has this interactive app. And I'm asking people if Douglass should be a suspect or a witness to the investigation of the Dominican racial imaginary, because Douglass in 1871 was sent through the Commission of Inquiry by Ulysses Grant to kind of assess if the African Americans, Black, that had settled in the Dominican Republic were interested in annexation to the United States. And the United States wanted to put a naval base in Samana. And it's kind of like the start of US imperialism. So, so I've used like archives from the entire research, and I've categorized the archives by the nation state, religion, culture, resistance, and those are kind of like the tags. And then people in the interactive app can comment to the archive. So some of the images that I'm sharing here are part of the app at the Shed. If you are based in New York, please come testify, because we really need to know if Douglass should be a suspect or a witness. But some of these images you could comment on. But what I did was I went to the New York Public Library and kind of look at the folders of both Douglass, but also the Dominican Republic and the history of the Dominican Republic, and also specifically this time on American history in 1871. So for instance, one of the images that is part of the app is this page from like a book in the, I don't know, I actually don't know what the book is, but typically if you go to the picture collection, there's like a bunch of like loose sheet pages. And this image I was interested in because it has like a photograph of, I'll pass it along here. As a photograph, that on top is a monument that it's called Faro Colón, and it was built, it was actually inaugurated in 1992, which is the 500th anniversary of colonization in the Dominican Republic. And this is actually has become both a print that I did at Blackburn, because the Dominican Republic says that the remains of Christopher Columbus are in the middle of that monument. If you see this monument from above, it's like a cross. So, and this monument was our kind of like our presentation to the World's Fair Pavilion in 1939. Let me know how I'm doing on timing. I actually don't know. But yeah, so I could share some of the images, and I think like how I see archives is I really think of past needs. I think of what is not there, like what, and what is the institution of the archive that I'm actually at? You know, what is like their political stand? What are the voices that are missing? Some of these images, for instance, like the images of the military in 1965 in the Dominican Republic, the U.S. invaded, and there was like una ocupación, like an occupation for almost a year. But there's no images of the civil resistance of that occupation specifically in this archive, and I'm always wondering why. and there's no images. There was like a huge artist movement that would kind of like create these beautiful graphics and wall pasted around the entire city. And there's no images of that. So what is it that's missing always? And how can I create spaces of participation where the community can have a voice in what is missing? So that's always kind of like the framework.
This is a good segue for me, because and for our librarians to speak a bit about their relationship to archive, because librarians and archivists are not only stewards and caretakers of the archive, but almost, and correct me, but almost like curators, like also deciding what goes in, right? Like, or collectors, maybe? Okay, so I'll, if anyone wants to pick that up and go about how librarians and archivists like shape the archive.
I could start as a librarian for the picture collection.
Can you talk a little bit about the picture collection too?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, well, the reason for why Lizania is able to bring the pictures down to Miami, and I also have an envelope of pictures from the picture collection, is that it's the only circulating collection in the library and the research branch on Bryant Park. So the Schwarzman building on 42nd Street is home to 5 art collections. There's the prints collection, the photography collection, art and architecture, Spencer collection, which is a collection of illustrated books and bookbinding across all cultures and time periods, and then there's the picture collection. So from the very beginning, the picture collection was meant to be a circulating collection so that it could serve an artistic, creative, visual community. It was born out of need just 4 years after the library opened, because so many artists were coming into the building asking for visual reference. Painters, sculptors, sign artists, theater artists, props designers, and today artists continue to come to borrow pictures to bring back into their studio and to integrate it as part of their visual or participatory or even like sound installation practice. Like anyone who's a visual thinker who needs to find some kind of inspiration or to do some specific research on how something might have looked in a different time, or how something could look because they're seeing that they're doing something that's actually very different, or they're seeing a lot of things that look a certain way, they can respond to that. And so in 1915, because of the creative community in New York, the picture collection was born by very, I think, like forward-thinking librarians who were like, oh, the kinds of questions that these artists are asking would be very hard to find in a book in a very quick, deadline-oriented schedule. And so they started to clip pictures from books and magazines and newspapers and organize them by subject heading, using the language of those who are coming in to request source material. And so now there's 12,000 subject headings. I was seeing that some of those were from Dominican/Live.
Yeah.
There's like a P. Frederick Douglass,
Yeah.
which means personalities. There's a whole collection in the picture collection of how famous people looked. I brought pictures to show you that like a subject heading could be something that's concrete, like an object. Like, oh, this is how cacti looks. This is how like certain species of flowers look. But verbs are also subject headings. Like there's folders of pictures for people walking, eating, kissing, talking, swimming, and then more like ethereal things have pictures too. Like moonlight is a folder. Shadows, contrast, perspectives. And everything is in there because enough people, even up to last week, are asking to see pictures of how this thing could look, or like events in history, how did that look? And because they're being clipped from books and magazines and newspapers, it means it's highly subjective. There is no hierarchy between fine art, commercial art, highbrow, lowbrow. It's all part of the visual world, and that is part of the practice of like anyone who's like a visual producer. It was imagined by certain people over time. We get to see how the world looked by different people in no kind of formal arrangement by the librarian. The librarian is only responding to the language of the question by the user, which means that subject headings, names for things change when countries are renamed. When more interests develop over a certain subject, that subject is created. So it's actually a very alive collection. It responds in real time to users. It is meant to be used. It means it's all ephemera. There is this confidence that we have in print culture that we can always clip a new picture out to feed the subject. And as a result, when you come into the library and you're opening up a folder, because it's circulating, you're going to see a different folder every time. You're going to have a different interpretation of the subject depending on the order that randomly you're seeing, because we don't sequence anything. The only thing that sequences is that the subjects are in alphabetical order. So there's a ton of randomness that takes place when you're browsing in the open stacks of the picture collection, which is something that a lot of artists have found to be essential in their practice. That a Google image search definitely can't give so many reasons. So it's a very reciprocal, dialogue-based, human, subjective-driven analog where the librarians are talking to each other. We're like, where do you think this picture should go? We're thinking about the researchers. We're thinking about recent requests. The image itself is subjective because it was made by someone from a particular time and place. The caption underneath the picture, if it's there, is subjective because it's the picture collection. We're not emphasizing text with these images. And so whatever came before or after that picture, if the researcher is interested in that book, we can tell them the magazine, the book, the publication information. But the visual literacy that takes place in the picture collection is about how literate can the picture be for you as one who's adopting it for your practice. But yeah, I would say it's highly reciprocal, and we embrace the subjective experience in the picture collection. We're not saying that this is what happened. The only thing that we know is that this was made and was printed, and now it's part of the clippings that we have.
Is the picture collection still growing?
It grows in subjects, like we created a drones subject folder recently. We created gender expression, we created hip hop, we created, it has something to do with the pandemic. That one is a new subject, I think, for us. But yeah, every day when we're not on the reference desk, we're clipping and assigning, we're thinking about the pictures and feeding the pictures, or feeding the folders rather. And so now there's almost 2 million pictures, and some of them will have to be let go of because they have degraded so much from use, but that's fine. And so pictures return from overdue checkouts. So we're still receiving pictures that were due in the 1990s. And so it's like new pictures for us practically.
So Lisa, can you talk a bit about the Vasari Project and also how that is growing and your work as an artist?
Sure. So the Vasari Project collects Miami's art history from 1945 onwards, right? And right now, we are also a living collection. And that was sort of the beginning. The Vasari Project was started by very forward-thinking librarians, which we're fortunate to have one of them here with us today. And it's become this resource for not only artists, but art professionals in the community. And the way that we kind of go through not only growing the collection, soliciting donations from artists and galleries and museums that we have relationships with, but actually going out into these communities. Something that Lizania had referenced was this kind of idea of archival silence, and how do we amend that? And the fact of the matter is that sometimes institutions have a role in that, but it's also up to the people working in these institutions to correct that, right? So we want to go, myself, I go to exhibition openings, I go to meet with artists and create these sort of relationships where we're actively collecting and making everyone know that we are not only a resource that is available to the public, to everyone's use here in Miami-Dade County, but to the artists to come and do research and use their archives to either add another layer to their art, or actually a really great example of something that happened recently. So there are a series of murals that were done by a Miami artist named Curtis Young, and there's only a couple of these murals still up. But one of them was done at the Bakehouse Art Complex, which is a residency here in Miami. And so recently RLA conservators came to do research at the Vasari Project because the library had worked with Purvis and had kept these materials at the pains that he had used. So that was an example of something that, in what other context would these materials have been saved if it wasn't for the work that these librarians did in the 80s and 90s, right? So I just, in the spirit of that, collecting these materials and making sure that we are actively representing the Miami art community, I think is what I want to impress.
So you've had many years at the library and working with the Blackburn archive. What's it like working with two archives? And yeah, anything to say about that and then sharing team?
I think, well, it was really exciting, and it was sort of so the library has the Vasari Project, which was founded in 2000 by two librarians and an art historian, Margarita Cano, Barbara Young, and Helen Cohen. And so I mentioned that because the two collections that really brought together the beginning foundation of the Vasari Project, one was Helen Cohen's collected ephemera that really documented, a time capsule of what was going on in Miami, and her writings and observations of artists that were working at the time in galleries that were open at the time. But also the documentation and support of the fine arts department, and also all of the exhibitions and all of the sort of documentation that came along with it. And so it really gave this time capsule for that. And so while going through those materials, we saw Rob Blackburn, and the permanent art collection at the library is over 6,000 works. And so much of what was in the fine arts department, which is now part of the Vasari Project, really documented those artists that were part of it. So I remember going to NADA 2 years ago, and then seeing the Blackburn booth, and then kind of having this really exciting moment, meeting Essie and being able to say, oh, we have Robert Blackburn, and we have materials about this, and it was just really exciting to be able to draw that line. And so as we've gone through further materials and kind of doing a deep dive into learning more about what that time was like, when Bob Blackburn came to Miami and had two exhibitions that he had going on celebrating the anniversary for the print shop, the 40th anniversary, it was exciting to sort of see how the photographs and the panels and the talks, the people that were involved in it, and then to happen upon slides that were from the print shop in our space. So that was really exciting. And so it was really a pleasure working on this project because of how we were able to work with the print shop and bring works from their location, be able to feature some really great works that are part of the permanent art collection. We're really lucky to have two Bob Blackburns. We have a Betty Saar. We have a Robert Bearden, Mavis Pusey. So all of these really great artists, and then we get to bring artists that we didn't have in the collection, but for the exhibit, like Dave Ringgold, which was really an exciting moment. And to really shed light not only on how important archives are to contextualize what these two institutions are doing for
for the love and the sake of art and also community and artists, but really to celebrate Bob Blackburn and the impression that he had even when he came to Miami, and he, thanks to Barbara Young, one of the founders of the Vasari Project, and having her take him to some colleges and to some high schools, and we were able to have documentation of that too, and really spoke to Bob, because you start to see these photographs and piecing them together, and Bob is always talking about art, and you can see it. You can see, and I can only imagine that was sort of a taste of that. And I think archives have this really great aspect of that. I mean, we can do it with our own scrapbooks and our, at home, you can kind of start to imagine what different times were. And so I think archives have so much power in that regard. And you can start to piece together these narratives.
I'm going to pose one question and then open it up to anyone who wants to answer. But we have the archives at the print shop, and we're often doing tours of our archive, and someone posed a question to both Essie and I. What is the difference between a collection and an archive? Anybody?
What is it that it's like all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads? So in line with that, all archives are collections, but not all collections are archives. We have book collections, we have photography collections. Archives end up being sort of beautifully nuanced in the way where one archive could have thousands and thousands of items, and so can collections, but I think that this tangibility and this itemized sort of level is where there's, I think, a difference.
And to add to that, I think that the mission of preservation is in the archive. You are stewards, you protect the archive. And then a collection doesn't necessarily always need that protection. And it speaks to different access points also. Like a collection could have extremely open doors, and then depending on the archive, it could be much harder to access because of the need to protect and to preserve. And often in both cases, the collection and the archive is a reflection of the people behind the collection or archive, in terms of what their goals are, their relationship with research and researchers. It is never really without that human touch, and so a strong relationship, I think, with the people who work in the library, the people who work in the archives, become really essential in any kind of research project, I would say. Like, it's never only the archive.
Yeah. It's like every time I go to an archive, the first thing I try to be friends with the archivist or the librarian, because they're the ones that are going to tell me what is not accessible or where else I should look at or what am I not thinking about with the question that I kind of landed in the place. So yeah, it's like the people are super important.
Yeah, some people working in any kind of collections or archival setting, they could have been there for 30 years.
Yeah.
And they know the collection better than the record keeping that has taken place. And sometimes that's simply how it is. So.
Does anyone in the audience have a question to ask our panelists, archivists, librarians about the archive?
Photo archive. How do you collect material for the photo archive?
The picture collection?
Picture collection, yes.
A lot of it is through donation of books and magazines, and like researchers who have been coming to us for like years might have an understanding of certain subjects that could be richer and more dynamic, and so then and if they're artists, they might come often. They'll bring their books or magazines. We also have subscriptions that are temporary for things or like, yeah, we might have magazine subscriptions just for like a year just to feed certain things, like a train magazine. Or recently we realized that we needed more on like funerary stuff. And so there was like a magazine subscription to, what do you call the funerary cars? Yeah, it was like our first magazine subscription. Then we unsubscribed after we got it. But we do have like a few, like two, like a whole stack worth of books waiting to be clipped. And they range from like magazines like Life magazine to artist monographs or collection catalogs or exhibition catalogs, or like children's books, tons of children's books. So.
I would like to hear a bit more about the speculative nature of the archive. I know Lizania touched on it in your practice, and research and archives. I think about the print series, one that's in the booth right now of Theodora, and there's no image of her in film. If correct me if I'm wrong, and then you're kind of developing it. So, as librarians, is there respect? Do you view the archive as speculative nature to it?
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I say there's absolutely. So, the job of the archivist and the librarian is kind of to try and remove as much of the speculation, because our job is to not only do the preservation of it, but these materials, if they're not accessible in the grand scheme of things, like we're not collecting things for the sake of collecting things. We're collecting them because they have to have the purpose and use, right? So there is a speculative nature in that. So like we get questions all the time on, for example, a couple of weeks ago, a young artist came in and was asking about kind of women's indigenous groups and like the resistance in this period of time in the 1960s or 70s. And so for me, I have my background as a historian, but it's not something that I've ever come across. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist. It's just to say that I haven't personally seen it. So it's like, well, it's a great question, right? So that's like speculation. Now we do the research, and again, that's my job as an archivist and librarian, is to find the best resources that I can to help address that. Whether they exist, and the sad part of it is that I can't will things into existence because the prompt was so amazing. I was like, I hope things exist, but I can't make them exist. So I have to find the subjects and kind of materials that best lend themselves to answer the question that this young lady had. So I know that really answered the question, but there is a sort of balance between trying to remove the mystery of what happens to the archives, and there's always ways to recontextualize materials. Everyone comes at things with a different lens, right? So I think that's an important kind of facet to also consider when you're approaching your research or sort of looking.
I guess I think of speculative just kind of maybe like when I'm seeing an archive, I clearly is something from the past that perhaps I have some context to it, perhaps I don't. For instance, one of the prints that's in the booth that is based on the Frank Leslie's newspaper, which was a prominent newspaper in the 19th century, and they did a special supplement for the Commission of Inquiry and documented and sent an illustrator to really document the life in Santo Domingo, but also like the interviews that Douglas was conducting. And Douglas, what got me to think about this particular piece was finding this archive and seeing an illustration of Douglas giving a speech to this community in Samana. And from the caption of the illustration, there was a note that said that the pulpit that Douglas used came from the Catholic Church. And I was like, that's kind of interesting because Douglas was not Catholic. The people that migrated there clearly came through the AME Church, so they are also not Catholic. So what is the connection here? And also then I started to find out about James E. Williams, who was the illustrator that went there. So I kind of came across, or like started to piece things together, like, damn, this is actually kind of propaganda, you know, for a project of the US. And then I built the pulpit sculpture speculative in some ways because I only had enough detail from this illustration. So then I went to the New York Public Library and did research in like the architecture collection to kind of see what were the detailed references of pulpits, Gothic style, that era. So that's what I mean when I am like looking at the archive with like a speculative perspective, because I'm not necessarily taking it as, you know, this is the image, this is the thing that it's telling the history. But again, how can we speculate beyond that image and sort of like bring a conversation that is like, right, what is cropped from this image and what is not there?
I think that the agency that can be experienced by an artist researcher in any kind of library or archival collection is part of the way that artwork can be progressed, developed, and can be like a source of inspiration to see what isn't there. And then that gives you the space to wonder why not.
Yeah, why not?
And then it gives you motivation to find the answer somewhere else. And it could be in another part of the library.
Yeah, it usually is, right? Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a lot when we're being approached with research questions. Sometimes the question's very broad and you try to narrow it down, and sometimes you just, like Louis was saying, you just don't have the answer, but you do try to figure out these different resources that you can use to get a little closer. But in the end, there is so much speculation in cases. I think about photography collections, and if it's only being seen from this one perspective, how much of, just like silence in archives, like how much is being omitted? What is the other view that is being excluded? We have a tremendously large photography collection at the library, the Romer collection, but much of it is really seen from a white perspective, and of that there is included of the Overtown, the historic Overtown, which is a black neighborhood. You only get to see it from where he's standing, and I mean it makes sense as to why, but in so many cases for historical purposes, you have to go and dig into the Miami Herald and into the Miami Times, a black newspaper, to really try to fill in those gaps. And yeah.
Sometimes the gaps and identifying the gaps and having conversations about it, that's where library programming becomes really important. Because that's another way of knowledge building, that when there are things in the collection that are not as strong as other parts of the collection, then there could be an opportunity to spotlight the parts of the collection that are there. And then emphasize the importance of it to the public, and because it's a library, it's going to be a free program for people to come in and then be able to have that conversation. So programming would be another way that activating the library space can help, not just among the individual researcher, but many bodies in the library at the same time having same conversation about the collection.
So to wrap up, I would like to hear about Miami-Dade Library and the Vasari Project programming, and welcome anyone in the audience who wants to sign up for a library card in New York or Miami to meet us at the table right outside in this area over here, and more information on programming, but you guys want to talk about programming and engagement with the public and knowledge building?
Sure. Just to say that, so the Vasari Project, as I mentioned, is a long-standing program. We were fortunate enough to receive funding through the Knight Foundation in 2021, and was part of the reason why we had the opportunity to do this exhibition, along with two others that are up right now, one at the main library and the other at Miami Beach Regional, which are on women's art history and also featuring local artists identifying as women that are currently as part of a neighboring archive called the Women Artist Archive Miami. And so those are going right now. One of the programs that we did was the artist workshops, which leads.
So one of the programs that we put together, and kind of addressing this idea of like knowledge building and access for the most part, right? So again, this idea of archival science is really, the amount of talked about it, I think it's very core to what happens in the archives. And so making these workshops, the archival workshop essentially is going to these artist residencies and opening up these programs to teach artists how to preserve their own work and how to kind of intellectually approach and govern their own materials. And the sake of that is the preservation and just teaching these skills that shouldn't be kind of gate-kept in any way, right? We're custodians. We're not here to keep these materials away from anyone. We want to share these things with everyone. So sharing that knowledge and teaching people how to kind of govern their own materials and put that intellectual control over it. And hopefully they will develop this relationship with the Vasari Project, with the public library, and those materials will find their way back to us at some point. Again, adding to the archival record, adding to the history and the narrative of Miami. But that's, and so that program has been met with relative success. Like, we've built a lot of relationships. We've gone to a couple, like 3 or 4 residencies, and we've had this program done at the public library where we do this presentation, actually hand out archival materials. So we get everyone started with some archival quality folders and some archival boxes, so that they can start preserving those materials that matter to them. And it's always interesting to me to see how artists kind of approach that preservation, and like how the materials that matter to them are always based on not just their art, but the personal, right? And how that is also illustrated in their environment. So that's what I'm saying.
And the additional programming that we'll be doing throughout the year is really centered around artist workshops for all ages, as well as some talks that are underway in the new year. Hopefully just centering around the exhibition, but also being done throughout the library system and supporting the local artists that are working.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
And use the picture collection, because that's like a very, I mean, as like an archive nerd and library nerd, it's a very special place that it's not usually that you get to like kind of spend time with like what you're researching and going back. Like, I'm usually taking photos and then have to go back because I'm like, oh, I forgot to do that. I forgot to take a picture of that. So it's an incredible resource.
And I have an envelope of 60 pictures from the collection. I'll have it out over there by me as a sign table for library cards for anyone who would want.